So today I'm joined by Phil from ELIL, European lawyers in Lesvos, but they're no longer just in Lesvos, as we're about to find out. So Phil, thank you so much for being on this. Please can you tell us a little bit about your work and ELIL?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this recording. ELIL, European Lawyers in Lesvos, as you say, no longer on Lesvos, or no longer just on Lesvos, I should say. We were set up in 2016, and we are an organisation that provides free legal assistance to asylum seekers in Greece. And the idea behind our organisation really came out following the EU-Turkey deal, and it was the idea that every asylum seeker who is going through the asylum process should have access to a qualified practicing asylum lawyer before their asylum interview. Um, at the time, there were very, very few asylum lawyers on Lesvos, and so we kind of created a model that combined the expertise of Greek asylum lawyers and volunteer European asylum lawyers to come to the island to work together to provide that interview preparation for people, so preparing them for their interview, then also working on family reunification as well. And over the past years, we've also developed a specialisation in assisting unaccompanied children, particularly with age assessment cases. So we now have a team on Lesvos, a team on Samos, and have just opened a new office on Athens. And um, um, overall, we've welcomed over 250 volunteer lawyers. We have a team of 8 full-time Greek asylum lawyers and have assisted almost 12,000 people.
It's so amazing the numbers of people that you've reached, and equally amazing that in pretty much 12 months, right, you've gone from just one location on Lesvos to now three. Could you tell us a bit about why you wanted to expand to Samos and then more recently to the mainland?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this illustrates the fundamentally shifting nature of this situation. I mean, of course, Lesvos has always been, well, for the past 5 years, kind of the main place, I suppose, in terms of the public conception of the situation in Greece as regards asylum seekers. But Samos was the island with the second largest number of asylum seekers. Back when we opened the Samos office in just about a year ago, there were over 7,000 asylum seekers living in a camp of only 650 capacity, so more than 10 times over capacity, which actually was more serious in terms of capacity and overcapacity than was the situation on Lesvos, although, of course, the situation on Lesvos was more notorious. There were only 4 or 5 at most asylum lawyers working on Samos back then, so proportionately it was more than 1,000 asylum seekers for every asylum lawyer, which of course meant that the vast majority of people were not able to speak to a lawyer before their interview. So that struck us as the logical next step in terms of the expansion of our work. We'd been working on Lesvos for about 4 years, and we had a tried and tested model. Effectively, we knew that this combination of volunteer European asylum lawyers and full-time Greek asylum lawyers was effective and did have an impact. Just maybe to illustrate that, the over the past 5 years, the average recognition rate of the cases we've worked on is 74.5%, whereas the average in Greece is 46.5%. So you can see that there's maybe a 30% difference there in terms of the impact that having a lawyer can have. And of course, that's not just ELIL, that goes for every lawyer and every legal assistance organisation. So we knew that the model worked, and so we wanted to expand to Samos, and we set up the Samos project last year, which was, of course, just after Corona started, so there's been some issues and some challenges there. And then from then on in, as of about 8 months ago, 9 months ago, particularly following the fire in Lesvos that destroyed the old Moria camp. There has been a large number of transfers of people from the islands to the mainland. And this sounds like a good thing. And in theory, it is a good thing, of course. I mean, the conditions and the situation on the islands was completely unsustainable, and something needed to be done about it. Um, the issue is, I suppose, that the people who have been moved, and on Lesvos alone, there's been around 7,000 people who've been moved in the last 8 months, is that they have been moved to the mainland, often in the middle of their legal process, often at extremely short notice. And so there is, it kind of cuts the linkages, both in terms of their linkages with their lawyer and also within the asylum process. So people arrive in Athens or Thessaloniki, often in many cases without necessarily somewhere to stay. So many people have ended up homeless on the streets of the cities, and also lost in terms of the asylum procedure because they need to go to the local asylum office, register, get onto the new electronic platform, reschedule their asylum interview, schedule their appointments to hand in documents, appointments to get decisions, all things like this, which are complicated, difficult with this new platform, but absolutely fundamental to their asylum procedure. And so there is a huge risk that people will, in the process of being transferred, lose those connections and end up, not being able to have legal assistance and struggling in terms of the asylum procedure on the mainland. So, in response to that, we opened the new office in Athens, and the idea is to both provide continuity for the people who we assist on Lesvos and Samos, who then get transferred to the mainland, so that we can ensure there is a kind of end-to-end provision of legal assistance for their entire case, and also to assist the tens of thousands of asylum seekers who are living in and around Athens, who are awaiting their interview. Now, of course, it goes without saying that there is a huge need on the mainland, and we will obviously there is no way that ELIL can solve that need, but our team will do everything we can to try and boost the capacity on the mainland and provide that continuity of people who are being transferred.
And so, I mean, I think that statistic that you showed about your success rate being almost 30% higher in terms of people being granted asylum versus the state average. And again, this story about how many people are just being moved to the mainland with no form of support and no guidance on the application process is just showing, I think, how many people who really do fall under the legal definition of a refugee and who really are in need of international protection because of fear of persecution are just so profoundly unprotected. And I think there's such a misconception that there are many bogus asylum seekers or perhaps people who are somehow slipping through the system. But I think those two pieces of information just show that it really couldn't be further from the truth. And you said that people are being dropped off from the island and are effectively becoming homeless in Athens because the Athens services are just not equipped to cope, I imagine. So, what's it been like? How different is it trying to work with asylum seekers and support them through their case on the mainland versus on the islands?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely 100% right in what you say, and that is something that has really struck me personally over the past 5 years. That there is a narrative that there are lots of people trying to beat the system somehow, and my experience is actually the diametric opposite, which is that people arrive, and it still continues to surprise me that there is an absolutely understandable lack of knowledge about the asylum procedure. And that lack of knowledge is because people are not given any information. People are not provided information when they arrive, not significant amounts. And the information people have comes from the smugglers, which often is not accurate, obviously. So people go through the process not realizing that this is a legal procedure, not realizing that there are criteria to be met, not realizing the importance of evidence, and that they need to articulate and explain everything that happened to them, and the reason for fleeing. Many people think it's simply an administrative process, and maybe just to give an example about this, and this is something that really struck me, and really made me realize the importance of legal assistance, which was when we'd only been operating for a few months. We had an office in Moria, and somebody came to me and asked me about, knew we were lawyers, wanted to talk to us. I spoke to him. He'd actually already had his interview, so there was nothing we could do at that stage. But we got talking about it, and he said that, yeah, he thought his interview had gone really well. And he explained what he had said in his interview, and he told them that he'd been a truck driver back in Iraq, and that if they gave him the opportunity, he would work really hard, he'd become the best truck driver in Greece, he would earn lots of money, pay lots of taxes, and become an upstanding member of Greek society. And I said, okay, but why did you leave? And he said, because I'm from a religious minority, and a religious militia killed my family. And I said, okay, but did you say that in your interview? And he said, no, because I didn't want the interviewer, for the Greek authorities, to think that I was going to be weak, I was going to be vulnerable, I was going to be problematic. I wanted to, show that I would be a good, kind of a member of society who would contribute to the Greek economy. And that struck me because that makes complete sense for somebody who knows nothing about asylum law. From an asylum law perspective, what he did, whilst completely understandable, was the worst thing he could possibly have done, because he's basically said to them, I am an economic migrant and I have no fear of persecution if I go back home. And even half an hour with an asylum lawyer, never mind a full preparation, would have enabled him to understand that actually the facts of why he left his country were of critical importance and needed to be articulated. So, yeah, I absolutely agree that that is a very, very significant element, and something that is, I think, still lost in the public kind of discussion about asylum seekers. The focus is much more on the so-called bogus asylum seekers rather than the people who have genuine cases and strong claims but are rejected simply because of lack of assistance from legal services. But going back to your question about the challenges or the differences on the mainland, obviously the context is different. On the islands, most people are living in the camps, so in some senses, identifying and accessing people is easier. Whereas in Athens, there are some camps, but most people live in the city, and so it's been more challenging maybe to kind of do that initial outreach. But we're working closely with organisations who are well established on the mainland to identify cases, and we're getting a higher proportion of referrals rather than walk-in cases at the moment. The cases and the needs are different. There is actually a more complex constellation of legal needs on the mainland compared to the islands. On the islands, it's generally interview preparation, family reunification, and age assessment. And whilst those three are still crucially important on the mainland, there are other things as well that are relevant to the asylum procedure, many of which relate to maybe the transfer of the files, the making of appointments, the submission of documents, following up with transfers for Dublin reunification cases, all of which are, again, because of the current situation compounded by COVID, really need a lawyer to help navigate through the process. So it's maybe a more varied kind of array of different legal needs on the mainland too.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up that anecdote about the man who wanted to be a truck driver, because that was one of the first interactions I ever had with you, and it has stayed with me. Because I think it just really highlights how set up for failure so many people are without access to any guidance whatsoever. And I know from what you've said, that this has changed in many ways with the start of COVID and having to move a lot of your services to become more remote. So just to slightly pivot down the COVID route, how has that affected the ways that you can support people and their navigation of the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason that I give that anecdote is because it really struck me as well. By profession, I'm not an asylum lawyer. I was a commercial lawyer in London, and one thing that really struck me when I arrived here was the lack of legal assistance and also the lack of importance given to legal assistance. You know, when I compared it to the work that I was doing in the UK, whereby you know, for a commercial transaction, or even I did a lot of work with the NHS, and there would be armies of lawyers on both sides working on whatever it was. Whereas here, somebody who's going through a legal process that, you know, in certain situations could be a matter of life and death, and there is no lawyers available. Whereas, you know, I think back to when you're in the UK, if you're buying a house, if you're doing something, you know, kind of mundane in terms of the legal procedure, you always have a lawyer. Whereas here, it's the exception rather than the rule, and that has been made more challenging and also more important by the pandemic, because what we have seen is a kind of a twofold change. First of all, there has been a pivot, shift from in-person interviews to remote interviews, and that has had a number of issues and challenges. So the what that means is that a person will be called to interview, and then they will be in a room either with the interpreter in person, but more generally with the interpreter remote and the caseworker remote. So they're on their own, basically, you know, two screens, or a split screen, I suppose, and having to recount their entire experience in that situation. There have been numerous concerns about confidentiality, with being able to overhear what's going on in adjoining rooms, issues with COVID-19 compliance because you know, small waiting areas, lack of social distancing, and also issues from a practical sense with connectivity. So you know, doing things online, of course, we all know there's the risk of things dropping out. And when somebody is in the process of explaining why they left their country, which may be, you know, an extremely, of course, is a very extremely stressful process and can be a very traumatic process. If the connection is lost, then crucial information could be lost as well. So there has been a move towards these remote interviews, and at the same time, following the fire in Moria, there has been the kind of full implementation of the change to the asylum law, which was actually brought in at the beginning of 2020, but was never properly implemented until after the fire. And one of the key elements of that is having much shorter notice interview dates. So what that means is that it's now absolutely normal for somebody on Lesvos or Samos to get told on Monday afternoon that their interview is at 7 a.m. on Tuesday. So people are given less than 24 hours, maybe 1 day notice, 2 days notice for their interviews. In certain cases, we've had one on Samos, one on Lesvos, where people were given only 30 minutes notice. So they went to the asylum office to schedule their appointment and were told, okay, your interview's in 30 minutes. Now, obviously, in this situation, it means it's extremely challenging for people to actually get legal assistance because there is no time. It gives people very little time to prepare their case, to gather the relevant materials, the relevant evidence. And so we are seeing people being a real focus on speed in the asylum procedure, which from our perspective is absolutely at the detriment of the integrity of the process, the quality of the interview process and kind of the outcome, and fundamentally the rule of law and the protection of human rights, because this emphasis on speed just to get through the cases is very problematic. Now, of course, the previous situation where it took on average 2 years for somebody from arrival to get their decision was too long. But we seem to have gone from one extreme to the other, from 2 years to 2 days. So the I think an interesting point about this is as well the how this fits in with the new proposals for the new Asylum Pact, because the emphasis in that is on having a quick border procedure and going through everything very, very quickly. We have seen on Lesvos in the last 8 or 9 months that in kind of preview, and the consequences are very, very concerning from a rule of law perspective. So I think that unfortunately, the trajectory is more towards quicker procedures rather than going back to what may be a more reasonable time for the procedures. It's a focus on getting people through the process rather than, I would say, a focus on actually getting the accurate, correct outcome for the case, no matter how long that takes.
And it's sad, really, because the solution to an overburdened asylum system was never just to rush people through with no regard for their ability to represent themselves. It was to place more support and more emphasis on due process. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have happened. But you did mention the new kind of border pact. Could you just tell a little bit more about kind of what that entails and what that could mean?
Sure. So this is the new set of legislative proposals. I think there are six acts in total, which are intended to consolidate and kind of update the Common European Asylum legislative framework. And it's still in the discussion and negotiation phase, but the material that has been produced has some clear emphasis and some clear aims, which is to, first of all, keep the principle whereby the countries of arrival are the countries responsible for processing, but putting a great focus on speed, so that with kind of distinctly stated deadlines about how long each phase should take, all of which are very short. If I remember correctly, it's intended that the entire border procedure will be done within 2 months, which is obviously very, very short. There is also a concerning new idea, which is the screening regulation, which is the idea that there would be a initial screening process whereby when people arrive, this is kind of a preliminary stage before their asylum application is considered. They go through this screening phase, and the outcome of that screening phase then determines which pathway they follow. And part of this is the idea that people from countries that are either demarked as safe third countries or countries with an average European recognition rate of less than 25% would be put through the fast track border procedure. Now, I think this, again, it illustrates a profound risk to the rule of law within the asylum procedure, because in our experience, actually, it's exactly those type of cases that are the ones that need the greatest time, the greatest amount of legal assistance, and the greatest amount of consideration. Because just because somebody comes from a country of less than 25% recognition rate does not mean that I think, yeah, but I think it's come back. So um, the just because somebody comes from a country of less than 25% overall recognition rate does not mean that that person does not have a valid asylum claim. Actually, by implication, it means that the people who do have valid asylum cases from those countries may be more difficult to identify, because the assumption is that they don't. And so, for example, if I think of an individual from the LGBTQI plus community from certain West African countries, that do have less than 25% recognition rate, but actually homosexuality is either illegal or culturally extremely kind of under attack, then it's exactly those individuals who would need significant legal assistance, support, to be able to be in a position to be able to talk about their case, articulate their case, and present it. That couldn't be done in a few days, which is what's envisaged in the border procedure, particularly as within that fast-track border procedure and the pre-screening regulation, there is a distinct question mark over the accessibility of lawyers, because there is this so-called fiction of non-territorial entry, meaning that actually the people who are going through the screening process wouldn't be legally considered to be on the territory of the EU. Now, what that means in reality, I don't think we know, but what it suggests is that there would maybe restrictions in terms of accessibility from everybody, but including lawyers too. So I think that this is a concerning development, and there are many, human rights organisations, bar associations, different legal organisations have raised concerns, and obviously it's still in the negotiation and kind of a drafting stage. But this, combined with the quick procedures we're seeing on Lesvos, combined with the ideas for the new camps on the islands, which will be semi-closed, or at least the potential to be restricted in certain senses, as articulated by the legislation, all points to a general trajectory of quicker procedures, maybe less easy access for NGOs and lawyers, and a focus on going through cases quickly, which all of which points to, I think, some concerning challenges on the horizon.
Yeah, and it's something we talk about a lot here at SolidariTee, actually, that people don't only flee their homes as a result of war. There are so many other forms of persecution that don't stem from the political or kind of the civil war. Like you mentioned being a member of the LGBT community, you also mentioned being part of a religious minority. And I think the assumption that people only flee their homes if their country is at war is so damaging to all of those people who really do have very specific and very legitimate fears of persecution. And once again, I think we see here rushing people through the system, especially people who maybe have never been able to speak to their experience or undergone significant trauma, will physically be unable to pass through one of these pre-screening processes, like just from a psychological point of view. So you mentioned that ELIL and many other actors are, in discussions and negotiations over these proposals. Is there anything that individuals who want to support fair legal aid can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are various things at various levels. I think the most important thing that anybody can do is to have the conversations, um, no matter who it's with, whether it's with your family member, your next door neighbor, a friend, or writing to your MP, getting in contact with pressure groups, advocacy groups, um, any mechanism of making sure that this is in the public eye and continues to be a source of discussion has a profound impact. And I really think that can't be overstated, because my experience when I talk to my friends and family back home, they're like, Phil, why are you still on Lesvos? Wasn't that issue solved like 4 or 5 years ago? Like, why are you still there? And I think, and it shocks me, of course, because for me, I think this should be front page news every day. The fact that the European Union as a concept, as an entity, is willing to have 20, 30, 40,000 people living in tents on the Aegean Islands for the past 5 years um, has been accepted, has been normalized. Um, I think that is an extremely concerning development. The fact that there are 150,000 asylum seekers in Greece, yet there is such resistance to relocating even a tiny number of those people, even a tiny number of the unaccompanied children within that group, is profoundly concerning. And the fact that that is no longer part of the political narrative and discourse in a sense of what can we do to resolve this, but rather is occasionally kind of, put up as a kind of a, way of saying, isn't this something that we should be fighting against? This kind of spectre of mass, kind of the people coming in, mass numbers coming in, and it's completely blown out of proportion because the numbers involved are very, very small comparatively. And of course, having even one person living in a tent on Lesvos or Samos um, for even one day is unacceptable from my perspective. That goes without saying. But when we look at the numbers across the entire European Union, it's a fractionally small amount, and it is something that can be resolved. The fact it is not resolved is simply a lack of political will. I remember talking to a colleague of mine. Well, actually, he worked for the Greek authorities, but we were chatting. He was from Sweden, and he said he couldn't believe that they had not managed to find a solution to the situation in Moria, because he said if you took everybody who was on Lesvos and divided it up by the municipalities in Sweden, so each municipality got a proportion of the people in the camp, it would end up at 5 people per municipality. So that's one country, 5 people per municipality, and Moria would have been, which was then 20 something thousand people, would have been completely evacuated. That just illustrates that this is a matter of political will or lack of political will rather than anything more fundamental. And I think that in all of this analysis and discourse, the key thing to remember is that this is a European issue. This is not a Greek issue. It's not an Italian issue, a Cypriot issue, a Maltese issue, or a Spanish issue. This is a European issue. And what we can all do as individuals is continue to put pressure on our representatives, um, uh, through conversations, through the media, through discussions, to remind representatives of their obligations and push them to try and find a humane solution to this that doesn't result in the situation we've seen in the last 5 years.
I really have nothing to add to that because that so encapsulates all of our views, and it's just, yeah, it's not only is it not acceptable, but it's actually just unnecessary, and I think that's what hurts the most. But
Mm.
luckily, we have people such as ELIL and all the other wonderful NGOs doing great things to try and combat this. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about your work and about the situation in Greece. And for anyone who'd like to learn more, please do head to ELIL's website or their social media pages for more.